Apparently, there's a special kind of tourist who sees a peaceful national park and thinks, great, a perfect place to audition for the afterlife. And trust me, whatever you've witnessed out there doesn't even warm up the stupidity we're about to hit. 1. A person at Yellowstone decided the best way to feel connected to nature was to climb over the safety barrier and wander directly toward an active geyser like it was a quirky hot tub that just happened to be loud, boiling, and older than civilization. And this individual marched forward with the confidence of someone who clearly believed the laws of thermodynamics were more of a casual suggestion than an actual rule. They crouched down to test the temperature by waving their hand over the vent, because nothing says genius like using your palm to assess volcanic plumbing, only for a ranger to sprint over in a way that communicated, without words, that this was the stupidest thing happening in the entire park that day. And yes, the park includes bison that lick car windows, so that's saying something. The ranger yanked them back just before a scalding blast erupted that would have instantly exfoliated them into a cautionary tale, and the tourists' only response was, "Wow, that was close," as if they hadn't nearly become a commemorative plaque. 2. A guy in the Smoky Mountains was absolutely determined to film what he believed would be the most epic bear encounter footage ever captured on a smartphone, despite having no training, no equipment, and absolutely no relationship with reality. He spotted a black bear peacefully flipping rocks for insects and decided this was the perfect moment to approach while loudly narrating his bravery, which the bear ignored because it had the self-esteem of a creature that doesn't need external validation. The man then attempted to lure the bear closer by offering a protein bar, apparently assuming bears follow keto, and when the bear predictably stood up in mild irritation, bear body language for "please stop being yourself," the guy panicked, threw the protein bar directly at its face, and sprinted away with the form of a malfunctioning shopping cart. Rangers later found him gasping behind a tree, announcing to everyone within earshot that the bear charged, which was generous, considering the bear had merely sighed and gone back to eating bugs. 3. In one national park, a woman spotted a towering elk in full antler glory and interpreted this as an invitation for a photo shoot, stepping closer and closer with the cautious precision of someone sneaking up on a celebrity they think owes them a moment. She instructed her partner to get the angle, as if she were photographing a bowl of brunch and not a wild animal capable of catapulting a sedan. The elk gave every warning sign imaginable: head tilt, nostril flare, a look that translated to, "Ma'am, please evaluate your life choices," but she remained committed to achieving what she thought would be her most liked post. So she spread her arms out, leaned in, and struck a pose within antler range. One ranger, watching from afar, later described the elk's expression as tired. And that's exactly what it looked like, as it did a tiny, unimpressed hop to the side, causing the woman to shriek, trip over her own ambition, and land butt first in the dirt. No injury, just a bruised ego and a phone filled with photos that documented the precise moment an elk gave up on humanity. 4. A tourist visiting a volcanic crater decided the posted warnings were clearly drafted for less adventurous people, and not for someone wearing brand new hiking boots and a motivational attitude, so they ventured off the designated trail toward a spot where steam vents hissed out of orange-stained rocks like the earth, whispering, "Turn back, you magnificent fool." Convinced they'd found the perfect shot, they edged closer, narrating how their bravery honored the spirit of exploration, although the only spirit involved was the growing frustration of the ranger who spotted them. The ground, famous for being thin, unstable, and actively trying to kill people, began to crack under their feet, and the tourist froze in place, suddenly realizing that geology does not negotiate. The ranger had to escort them back step by step, one tense foot at a time, and the tourist insisted afterward that they weren't scared, which was an interesting interpretation of someone who had spent 10 straight minutes inventing new breathing patterns. 5. One person at Arches National Park decided the best way to experience the desert up close was to wedge themselves into a narrow sandstone crevice, apparently believing they were auditioning for a geological birth canal. They squeezed deeper, bragging to their friends about being a natural climber, unaware that sandstone has all the structural integrity of stale toast. After a few triumphant shimmies, gravity made its opinion known by locking them in place like a monument to poor decisions. Their friends tried tugging them out, which only succeeded in creating the world's saddest tug-of-war, until rangers arrived with equipment and the energy of people who have definitely seen this before. After an hour of awkward extraction, the person emerged scraped, dusty, and loudly declaring that it looked tighter from the outside, a statement that did nothing to restore the dignity they had left in the rock. 6. A man hiking in Yosemite found a group of mule deer grazing and decided this was the moment to fulfill his lifelong fantasy of becoming some sort of antlered Dr. Dolittle, slowly approaching them with hands out like he expected one to choose him as its new leader. The deer, having the emotional investment of a houseplant, calmly backed away, but the guy kept following, whispering what he believed were soothing words but sounded more like someone narrating a haunted doll documentary. After several minutes of unwanted pursuit, a doe flicked her ear, which in deer language translates to, "Please stop auditioning for a nature documentary." Yet he persisted until one gave a small warning stomp that finally convinced him retreat was the superior plan. He ran back toward his group, boasting that he had gotten really close, which was technically true because he had nearly negotiated his way into becoming a caution sign. 7. A tourist at Zion spotted hikers cooling off in a shallow river and decided that if other people could wade safely, then surely the middle of the fast-moving current was an equally great place to stand, because apparently human logic is optional when the water looks aesthetically pleasing. They waded deeper, ignoring the increasingly loud sound of water rushing around rocks big enough to erase ankles from existence. When their feet slipped on algae-slick stone, they attempted a dramatic windmill recovery that only made the situation more slapstick before the current spun them downstream like a confused garden gnome. Other visitors scrambled after them while the person bounced along, flailing in a manner that suggested they were negotiating with water. Eventually, someone grabbed their arm and hauled them onto a rock where they immediately launched into a speech about unexpected conditions, which seemed bold considering the river had been visibly raging like a caffeinated blender. 8. In Glacier National Park, someone tried to take a selfie on a patch of late spring snow because it looked solid, a phrase that has historically led many people to discover what gravity thinks about optimism. The tourist stepped onto the snowfield, posing triumphantly, unaware that the thin crust was the only thing separating them from a steep, icy slope. The ground collapsed beneath them, sending them sliding downhill at cartoon speed while their phone, still recording, captured their increasingly creative selection of panic noises. They finally managed to stop themselves by grabbing a stubborn bush clinging to the hillside, looking like a nature-themed Christmas ornament stuck to a shrub. Rangers helped them climb back up as the individual insisted the snow didn't seem dangerous, though their 15-second slide whistle routine suggested otherwise. 9. A visitor to Joshua Tree decided that the best way to show appreciation for desert conservation was to climb a boulder clearly marked with a "Do Not Climb" sign, because nothing enhances the outdoor experience like immediate disobedience. The rock, shaped like a sloping dome of sandpaper, offered zero grip, but the tourist attacked it with the determination of someone trying to impress absolutely no one. Halfway up, gravity gave a gentle nudge, sending them skidding down the surface like a cheese grater audition. They landed in a cloud of dust and pride fragments, insisting they meant to do that, while their friends stood silently, knowing full well the rock had won without even moving. 10. In a Utah canyon, someone tried to recreate a cinematic cliff-edge moment by standing dramatically on a tiny protruding rock shelf, which was bold considering the ledge resembled a stale cookie glued to a vertical wall. They spread their arms out for the picture, shifting their weight just enough to make the rock wobble in a way that strongly suggested they should reconsider their hobby choices. The person dropped to their knees, clinging to the shelf with the enthusiasm of someone who had just realized movies use stunt coordinators for a reason. Their companions pulled them back onto stable ground, at which point the tourist proclaimed the ledge was less stable than expected, which is exactly how geologists describe things moments before they collapse. 11. A man at Grand Teton National Park saw a moose lounging in a marsh and decided this was the perfect opportunity for an epic wildlife portrait despite moose having the temperament of overworked middle managers and the body mass of compact cars. He approached slowly, waving his arms in a gesture he believed communicated friendliness, but probably read as, "I am bringing chaos." The moose lifted its head with the weariness of a creature constantly disappointed by tourists and subtly shifted its stance, a polite moose warning which is the wilderness version of clearing one's throat. Instead of retreating, the guy kept inching closer until the moose gave a small but meaningful grunt that finally snapped him back to reality, prompting a stumble backward into the marsh where he emerged soaked, muddy, and still insisting he almost got the shot. 12. One visitor in Sequoia National Park decided to climb a fallen giant sequoia trunk, which seemed harmless until they realized the trunk sloped upward at a treacherous angle and acted like a giant wooden slide coated in polished bark. The tourist climbed anyway, panting dramatically while narrating their epic ascent to absolutely no one, until they reached the halfway point and discovered their shoes had the traction of warm butter. One slip sent them sliding back down in a stiff, resigned position, like a puppet whose strings had been cut, landing directly in a patch of damp soil that welcomed them with a soft thud. They stood up calmly, announcing the fall was part of the fun, though nothing about their dirt-covered backside supported that claim. 13. A tourist at Everglades National Park attempted to lure an alligator closer by splashing water with their hands, perhaps believing they were summoning a misunderstood reptilian friend instead of a prehistoric predator that interprets splashing as the buffet is self-delivering. The gator drifted toward them with the slow, silent glide of something built by nature to solve problems violently, and only then did the individual realize they were kneeling at the exact distance nature categorizes as appetizer range. A guide shouted for them to back away immediately, which they did, but with the posture of someone trying not to look like they were in full panic, hands raised as if surrendering to the universe. Afterward, the person claimed they didn't think the gator would actually come, a statement that suggests they believed alligators operate on some kind of reservation system. 14. In Rocky Mountain National Park, a woman saw a herd of elk resting in a meadow and decided that the most appropriate response was to walk into the center of them for a serene photo op, seemingly unaware that elk are not decorative lawn ornaments, but large, occasionally irritable animals with sharp antlers. She confidently strode into the group like she was late for a staff meeting, causing several elk to stand up in a wave of silent, annoyed motion. One flicked an ear, another stamped lightly, and the woman suddenly remembered she had somewhere else to be, turning around with an awkward half-jog that communicated both urgency and denial. She rejoined her group, insisting they seemed friendly, which is an inspiring level of optimism for someone who had just jogged out of a mild elk uprising. 15. A visitor at Banff insisted on approaching a mountain goat grazing peacefully near a trail, ignoring every warning sign and every nearby hiker whispering, "Please don't." Mountain goats, notoriously unfazed by cliffs but extremely fazed by humans invading their bubble, responded exactly as expected when the person got close, by giving a pointed glare followed by a slow, deliberate step forward, which in goat language translates to, "Remove yourself from my personal space immediately." The tourist froze, reassessing their belief that goats are cuddly alpine pets, before stumbling backward and tripping over a small rock, landing in a patch of wildflowers they definitely weren't supposed to. Squash. Once safely away, they insisted the goat seemed aggressive, when in reality the goat had behaved with the restraint of a creature that has survived thousands of years without ever needing to deal with influencer energy. 16. A person at Yellowstone watched a bison lounging in a meadow and decided the only reasonable response was to wave their jacket like they were auditioning for a low-budget rodeo, apparently forgetting that bison are essentially prehistoric bulldozers wrapped in fur. The bison lifted its head with the expression of a creature trying to calculate whether this was performance art or just garden variety human nonsense, and when the tourist stepped even closer, shouting, "Hey buddy," with the confidence of someone addressing a golden retriever, the bison stood up with the slow inevitability of a natural disaster. The tourist finally realized they were in trouble, performed a spectacularly uncoordinated pivot, and sprinted toward the parking lot, arms flailing like wet spaghetti while their friends captured the entire escape sequence on video. The bison didn't even chase. It just watched them flee with the bored judgment of a gym teacher timing a very disappointing mile run. 17. In Yosemite, someone decided they wanted a picture at the edge of the waterfall, which is a poetic way of saying they wanted gravity to issue a performance review. So they inched out onto a slick granite slab that had been polished by millions of years of erosion and exactly 0 moments of mercy. Despite clear signage, yelling strangers, and the unmistakable sound of water thundering into the abyss, the tourist insisted it was totally safe, because apparently personal logic overrides hydrodynamics, and when they spread their arms to pose, One foot slid in a perfect demonstration of nature's slapstick instincts. Luckily, they dropped flat and grabbed a protruding rock that stopped them just shy of becoming mist, while their companion screamed their name like this was a dramatic finale rather than a very dumb beginning. Rangers later informed them that waterfall edges are not a lifestyle choice, to which the tourist replied, "It just looked so stable," proving they had misdiagnosed both the rock and their own judgment. 18. Over in the Grand Canyon, a visitor spotted a family of condors perched near a cliff and decided the best strategy was to get closer for scale, as if the canyon itself wasn't enough backdrop. They crept forward with the stealth of a malfunctioning vacuum cleaner, startling the condors, which took off in a rush of wings so powerful that the resulting gust nearly toppled the tourist. Because yes, when you walk directly toward a bird with a 10-foot wingspan, the consequences tend to be aerodynamic. The person staggered, windmilled, and only barely avoided turning their vacation into a forensic diagram, eventually collapsing onto the ground with an exhausted huff. Afterward, they insisted they had simply lost their balance, refusing to consider that perhaps the condors also had notes about their performance, probably starting with, "Please stop treating us like scenery that flaps." 19. A hiker in Zion decided to beat the desert heat by lying down in the narrow middle of a heavily trafficked trail shaded by high canyon walls, announcing to their companions that the cool rock surface made it the perfect place to rest, apparently overlooking the fact that trails exist for walking and not impromptu human naps. As groups of hikers approached and attempted to navigate around them, the person remained committed to their geological spa day, eyes closed, arms spread, absorbing the ambient annoyance of dozens of people forced into single-file traffic. Eventually, a ranger approached and politely informed them that lying in the trail wasn't allowed, to which the hiker groggily replied that they were just connecting with the earth, a statement that would have been more convincing had the earth not been actively supporting an entire line of irritated backpackers stepping over them like a sunburned speed bump. 20. In Great Smoky Mountains National Park, someone saw a sign warning hikers not to feed wildlife and chose to interpret it as an invitation for DIY wildlife diplomacy. They unwrapped a granola bar, held it out like a peace offering, and attempted to coax a raccoon closer, while narrating the moment in a voice better suited for children's story time. The raccoon approached slowly, not because it was charmed, but because it had correctly identified the human as both predictable and edible. And when it lunged for the snack, the person shrieked, dropped the granola bar, and sprinted away while the raccoon happily secured its prize. The tourist later complained that the raccoon was aggressive, which is a fascinating way to describe an animal that behaved exactly like a raccoon and not at all like the imaginary woodland ambassador they were expecting. 21. A visitor at Acadia decided to climb onto a rocky coastal outcrop to take a photo with waves crashing behind them, because nothing says vacation memory like flirting with tidal physics. They timed their pose between waves, carefully waiting for the dramatic moment, unaware that oceans do not negotiate with scheduling requests. When the next wave arrived, larger, louder, and filled with centuries of pent-up comedic timing, it blasted the rock hard enough to knock them flat, washing them several feet before retreating and leaving them sprawled like a discarded beach puppet. Their clothes, dignity, and phone all ended up soaked, and they stumbled back toward the safe area, announcing that the wave came out of nowhere, a statement that puzzled every witness standing in full view of an entire ocean. 22. In Glacier National Park, a person saw a warning sign about mountain lions and instantly assumed this meant they were now in a thrilling nature documentary, so they began loudly discussing how they would totally know what to do if a mountain lion appeared, complete with hand gestures, martial arts stances, and several imaginary fight scenarios that indicated neither biology nor self-preservation had been consulted. Moments later, they spotted a shadowy figure between the trees and froze, convinced they had manifested a predator through sheer narrative enthusiasm, only for the shape to step forward and reveal itself as a middle-aged hiker adjusting his backpack. The person screamed anyway, because apparently fear had entered the chat, and tried to explain to nearby hikers that they were just being cautious, though nothing about their reaction suggested preparation so much as spontaneous emotional combustion. 23. A tourist at Bryce Canyon decided the optimal way to capture hoodoos was by climbing onto a narrow sandstone pedestal, ignoring the tiny problem that sandstone erodes roughly as fast as their decision-making skills. They hoisted themselves up, posing triumphantly as wind gusted across the canyon. And just as their photographer framed the shot, the pedestal shifted a few centimeters in a way that suggested the rock had never signed up for this partnership. The person froze like a statue, realizing they were standing on a different statue, and carefully lowered themselves back to solid ground with the same energy as someone trying not to wake a sleeping dragon. Afterward, they claimed the rock moved unexpectedly, but considering the entire landscape was fashioned by erosion, it's unclear what part of that surprised them. 24. In Olympic National Park, someone decided that the best way to admire a tide pool was to kneel directly in the middle of it, plunging their hands into the water and enthusiastically poking every visible creature like they were exploring a cosmic vending machine. The resident anemones responded in the only way they could, by clamping down on stray fingers, prompting the person to flail backward with all the grace of a startled pelican, splashing bystanders and nearly flattening a patch of protected algae. They staggered onto dry ground and announced that the tide pool had attacked them, which is a bold interpretation of events considering they were the ones sticking their fingers into living organisms like a toddler interrogating a dessert tray. 25. A visitor at Death Valley decided to test whether the ground was really as hot as they say by attempting to fry an egg on the pavement, because nothing elevates a national park experience like culinary experiments involving asphalt. They cracked the egg with theatrical flair, only for the yolk to immediately ooze into the sun-baked surface and congeal into something that looked less like food and more like a disappointed ghost. Unsurprisingly, the tourist became frustrated when the egg didn't sizzle dramatically, declaring the heat overrated despite standing in May, a location famous for melting shoes. Nearby visitors watched them try, fail, then try again, using a metal pan that immediately branded their hand with a lesson they could have learned from any brochure. 26. A person wandering through Shenandoah National Park became convinced they could identify edible plants based solely on positive energy, a method famously unsupported by literally every field guide ever written. They plucked random leaves, sniffed them with theatrical seriousness, and confidently announced which ones were safe, prompting horrified hikers to intervene before they swallowed something that would turn their afternoon hike into an emergency evacuation. When politely informed that botany requires more than vibes, the tourist shrugged and said they just had a feeling, which might be the most concise summary of why park rangers don't get to have normal workdays. 27. A group visiting Hawaii Volcanoes National Park decided to create a historic moment by tossing a coin into a lava flow, possibly under the impression that molten rock is just a fiery wishing well. They tossed the coin, which vaporized instantly in a tiny flash that should have signaled something important, but instead inspired them to consider throwing a second coin, prompting bystanders to intervene and explain that lava is not a souvenir incinerator. The group insisted they were just being symbolic, though the only symbol being generated was the international sign for "Please stop before we all end up in a documentary about tourist behavior." 28. In Rocky Mountain National Park, someone tried to outrun a fast-moving hailstorm because they believed they could beat it to the car, which was optimistic, given that the storm was already pelting the mountains with ice bullets. They sprinted down the trail, slipping on wet rocks while shouting a motivational speech to themselves, and were eventually forced to huddle under a pine tree as hailstones the size of grapes ricocheted off their backpack. When they finally reached the trailhead soaked, bruised, and panting, they declared they almost made it, ignoring the fact that nature had lapped them by several miles. 29. At Badlands National Park, a visitor decided to walk off trail to get a photo inside a crumbly clay formation that looked like a miniature fortress, blissfully unaware that Badlands clay erodes faster than a New Year's resolution. As they stepped inside, the walls began quietly disintegrating, sprinkling dust like a polite preview of collapse. And when they tried to pose with arms raised, a large chunk broke off behind them, prompting a dramatic yelp and an extremely hasty retreat. They emerged coated in powder that made them resemble a confused pastry and insisted the structure was unstable, which is exactly why every sign in the park had recommended not going into it in the first place. And that's the grand tour of tourists versus nature, where common sense never even got on the bus. Drop your vote for the dumbest stunt below and stick around. The chaos only gets worse.